Alright, what's up guys, and welcome back to another Yu-Gi-Oh video. So in today's video, we're going to be looking at the three main grading companies for TCGs and Yu-Gi-Oh in particular at the moment, which are PSA, BGS, and CGC. Pretty much giving a rundown of everything that you might want to know if you're looking at where to send your cards. So looking at the case, looking at the grading scale, looking at the perks that each company has, like grading errors and things like that. Kind of the relative value of sending to each place. And even stuff like the consistency of the grading and the handling of the cards. So some of this is more objective, some of it is more subjective, but I kind of wanted to just make a video to give you guys my opinion on everything as things stand in 2022. So I made a video about 2 years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago, comparing PSA and BGS. And to be honest, at this point, I don't think anything I said in that video is really relevant anymore because the grading scene has just changed a lot. Different companies have gone in different directions. So yeah. Without further ado, let's just get right into it and start looking, first of all, at the cases. So the three different cases are like this. This is CGC on the left, PSA in the middle, BGS on the right. PSA is easily the most recognizable case. BGS has also been around for a long time. CGC only started like a couple of years back, and for Yu-Gi-Oh, they've only started this year. So I'd say they're a lot less recognizable. But yeah, in terms of the aesthetics of the case, I don't want to get too much into that. I think it's generally accepted that the CGC case isn't quite as attractive with the label as the other cases. But if we're just talking about the actual quality of the case, then I'd actually say CGC has the best quality case by quite a long way. Very, very firm plastic. It doesn't bend at all. There's no kind of give. And also just beautiful clarity where you can really see the quality of the surface of the card, both on the front and the back. Makes it very easy to assess like how strong a grade is, the actual condition of the card inside the case, and also means that it displays really nicely. So yeah, they have the best cases. The other two both have kind of pros and cons, I guess. BGS has very thick cases, so it protects the card extremely well, especially because of the inner sleeve. It actually has the best overall protection. And the nice thing with BGS cases is you never have to worry about the card rattling. So both PSA and even to a lesser degree CGC. This one doesn't seem to rattle. I've had a few that do. But just because there's no inner sleeve securing the card, you do get movement within the case. BGS, if you really bang the card around, you can get it to move in the inner sleeve, but there's no movement just doing that. So that's kind of the positive aspect of it. The negative aspect, I guess, would just be the clarity. If you kind of put a light over the card, you're always going to get that like distortion in the sleeve, which kind of messes with the aesthetics a bit. And assessing the quality of the surface on the back is extremely difficult if you're trying to get an idea of the condition of the card. So yeah, BGS is great for protection, not so great for display. PSA is pretty good for display. It's still not actually as clear as CGC, but the big problem with PSA and why I'd say they have the worst cases is just the flimsiness of the material. So you can bend a PSA case pretty easily. I'm not going to do it because I don't want to crack the case right now. But if you apply full force, you can pretty much just get a PSA case to snap open with your hands. So that's not great. It is tamper-proof, like you can't open it and reseal it. But just in terms of feeling like your card is protected, it's really not in a PSA case. And it can even get damaged in the case. Often they're not sealed correctly, so if the card slips into one of these kind of sealing lines on each side of the case, then it can get stuck in there, and then if you bring it out again, it can kind of get damaged in the process. Part of the edge can get stuck in the side of the case. So yeah, overall, really not great. And it's not that rare also for there to be encapsulation damage from PSA. Again, just because of how the cases fit together. So in terms of cases, CGC pretty much wins on every front. I guess the only one BGS wins on is protection. PSA pretty much doesn't win on any front, but it's still a pretty good looking case. And at the end of the day, they're the industry standard, so I guess they have the least pressure on them to do anything special. Yeah, so moving on to the grading scale, all of them go 1 to 10. I mean, I assume most of you guys are fairly familiar with it at this point, but PSA is pretty much 1 to 10 with nothing in the middle. It does have 0.5 grades, but they're very rarely awarded. There's no 9.5. 10 is gem mint. Both of the others go 1 to 10, but with 0.5 all the way, including 9.5, which is gem mint, and then 10, which is pristine. Now, I guess a lot of people look at them and they think the grading scales are the same just because they have pretty much the same names and things like that. The only real difference technically would be that if you get 4 10s on a CGC slab, it's called a perfect 10. If you get 4 10s on a BGS slab, it's called a black label. The actual label is black and gold instead of gold with black. But I would say the grading standards are actually quite different. So this isn't about consistency or anything like that. BGS has the harshest scale. So to get a 10 on any subgrade on a BGS card, in theory, putting aside whether it's done in practice or not, requires that subgrade to be pretty much perfect. So with centering, it requires it to be 50-50 to the naked eye, both on the front and the back, or certainly on the front and very well centered on the back as well. CGC is not quite like that. The card could be a tiny bit off center, it can still get a 10 on centering. 10 on edges, corners for BGS, you need like nicely cut edges, zero whitening, absolutely nothing wrong with it, nice shape on the corners. I'd say for CGC, you need pretty much zero whitening, but you can have 1 or 2 tiny dots and that's okay. With the corner shape, it's not as important. If they're clean, then it'll often be allowed to get a 10, even if they're slightly irregularly cut. And again, on surface, BGS, it's almost impossible to get a 10 surface on an old school Yu-Gi-Oh card because you need a surface that has 0 scratches front or back, which very rarely happens. CGC is pretty difficult to get a 10 on surface, but it's not as difficult, essentially. Getting a PSA 10, which is just a gem mint grade, is lower than either of those standards, but I would say, so the PSA 10 standard is probably closer to the CGC 10 standard than the CGC 10 standard is to the BGS. So it's like a 3-way hierarchy of how harsh they are for the absolute highest grade, and BGS is quite a bit higher than either of the other two, in my opinion. In terms of going lower down the scale, PSA has the most kind of clear-cut system, I would say, for going 1 to 10, like what is a 3, what is a 5, what is a 7, etc. BGS has the worst system. Anything below a 9 is very questionable with Beckett. 8.5s can be clean, they can be pretty much trashed. And when you get down to like BGS 7s, 6s, and 5s, it is really just all over the place. CGC is, I think, somewhere in the middle. They're pretty generous with grading in general, so CGC 6 tends to look worse than a PSA 6. But I think they're a little bit more consistent about what it means than BGS still. Now, in terms of like other considerations, like the kind of perks that each company has, PSA has the least of those. So if we're talking about grading errors, grading misprints, miscuts, all that kind of stuff, PSA is pretty unreliable. They do have a miscut grade and an off-center grade, but it's very hard to know when they're going to give them out and when they're not. BGS is a lot better than PSA like that, but it's still unpredictable to an extent. And with like miscut cards, they give them a 1 on centering, which I think is just really stupid. It means that if you have a pack fresh card and it's like miscut to the point where another card is showing, since the centering is a 1, the highest grade you can get is like a BGS 3 on a mint card, which to me makes no sense. But they do grade errors, they grade the majority of misprints, and most of the time they give them pretty accurate labels as well. So this card's faded, this blue eye's on the right, and you guys can see they've labeled it as a printing error as a result of that. But CGC is like far and away the leader in that category. It was like a big thing when they launched a couple of years back grading Pokemon cards, that they would grade these prototype cards and these error cards and things like that. So if the card has a notable error, like this Dark Magician has a foil line, you guys can hopefully see just there. They'll label it as an error on the front, and when you turn it over to the back, it'll tell you what the error is. So they're definitely the best company at the moment for grading anything kind of, that's not just a regular card. So whether it's a sample or, some kind of prototype card or a test print or a filler or misprint, they will give you the most accurate description on the label, and they'll probably be the most open to grading it as well, whatever it might be. Next question would be value. PSA has the best value by far, and that's not to say like the same grade is worth more. So for example, like a PSA 10 is actually worth less than a CGC 10 slightly, and it's worth a lot less than a BGS 10. But if you're looking at the value for money of submitting your cards, if you send a bunch of pack fresh cards, you're going to get some PSA 10s. If you send a bunch of pack fresh cards to CGC, you should get 1 or 2 10s. on a big order, but you'll get a lot fewer than you'll get PSA 10s. And with BGS, if you manage to get some 10s, you get amazing value, especially if they're black labels. But to put it in perspective, I've sent like about 500 to 600 cards to BGS over the years, and I've had 2 BGS 10s ever. And the majority of the cards I sent were pack fresh. So that's like a, I don't know, 0.3% success rate of getting a 10 on a clean card. PSA, I'd say like 25% probably of the clean center cards that I send get 10s. On CGC, it's maybe about 10%. So yeah, it kind of puts it in perspective. You get the best value out of PSA because you actually have a great chance of getting 10s in the first place, and they have great value. And the other companies, you can get slightly more value if you get the 10s, but if you get 9.5s, you're getting a lot less value than PSA, and it's a lot harder to get 10s. Now, that's kind of, I guess, the more objective stuff I've got out of the way, hopefully, so far. If we're looking at questions of like consistency and like the quality of card handling, obviously this is more just based on personal experience. I have subbed many thousands of cards overall. Like I've subbed over 100 to each company now at this point. Probably about 1,000 to PSA, yeah, 500-600 to BGS, and about 100-150 to CGC. And it's also something that fluctuates. So like a couple of years back, I felt that BGS was doing a much better job than PSA. At this point, BGS has gone downhill a lot in the last couple of years. They're really just not making any of the right decisions. And sending cards to BGS at the moment, you're pretty much just going to get hammered. I haven't even sent many cards to them this year, but the majority of submissions I've sent, even if it's just been 2 or 3 cards, the grades haven't made any sense relative to what I would expect on them. PSA does have a lot of inconsistency as well. I guess in both directions, you can get 10s which really don't deserve 10s, and sometimes you send cards which deserve gems and they get 7s and 6s. I've regraded at least 1 or 2 7s this year to 10s alone, which shouldn't happen, but that is just a thing that happens with PSA. Obviously, they don't have subgrades on their scale like the other companies, and I think that is something that just gives you more room for kind of discrepancies. I guess that's another thing I should point out with the scales is with CGC and BGS, you can get no subgrades. So then it's kind of just like a PSA, a single grade on the label. But they also offer subgrades for an extra cost. And that, in theory, is something that adds accountability to the grading process, although not really in practice. So yeah, I would say at the moment, BGS is doing a really bad job for, well, I guess not so much consistency as just giving cards what they deserve. Like they're really not putting their theoretical scale into practice at the moment at all correctly. PSA, I'd say, is probably doing a better job than they were 2 years back. You always get some crazy results in submissions, like I said, but probably 90% of the cards that you send will get at least within the range that you could predict from them. So like if it's an 8 or a 9, it'll get one of those 2 grades. And it's kind of probably only about 10% where it gets actually outside the range of anything you could predict. CGC, they've only launched this year, so they're smaller. And when you're new and you're not getting as many submissions, it is easier to be consistent. And I think that's definitely something you have to take into account. Because like, you know, PSA has a much harder time being consistent than CGC because they're grading many, many times more cards just in terms of sheer volume. So they have more graders. There's just more room for, I guess, yeah, discrepancies and subjectivity to take part. But as things stand, from my experience with CGC, same with other people's experience that I've spoken to since they launched for Yugioh earlier this year, they are by a decent distance the most consistent grading company, especially for the condition subgrades. Centering is weird. I don't know why no one can get centering right. BGS often gives completely wrong centering subgrades. CGC as well. I've had very OC cards getting like 9.5 centering, perfectly centered cards getting 8.5 centering. It's disappointing to see because it is something you can literally measure and just not have the subjectivity involved. But yeah, aside from that, on the condition subgrades, they've been very good, I would say. Only a handful of cards out of the like 100 plus that I've had back from them. Probably only 3 or 4 cards had condition subgrades which were outside the range of what I expected. So like if I was thinking this would be a 9 or 9.5 surface, like 99% of the cards I've sent have got either one of those 2 grades. And only kind of 1, 2, 3% have got, let's say, an 8 surface when I expected a 9.5 or something like that. So yeah, I've been very impressed with the consistency overall. And the same thing goes for card handling as well. if you send cards to PSA and even BGS these days, there's a significant risk that they're going to get damaged. BGS, it's usually like a nick on the top and the back. I've had that on so many cards I've sent to them over the years at this point. PSA is more varied. I've had creases, I've had dents, I've had like big bits of edge wear. They're just all over the place with card handling, and it makes it very, I guess you're always worried sending a high-end card to PSA because sure, like 95% of the time it's going to be fine, but there's a legitimate chance that your card will get badly damaged, and that is kind of scary depending on the card. CGC, I've had 100 plus cards back. Literally only one of them had any kind of damage, and that was a European print ulti, which have like very, very fragile back edges and corners, and they just like nicked the one edge a little bit, which is still bad, but relative to the other two companies, I've been very impressed with the handling. Even on fragile cards, they come back exactly as I send them, and that's something that really makes me enjoy sending to CGC at the moment. Just not really having that extra worry of kind of what's actually going to happen to the card. Is it going to look the same when I get it back? So yeah, I think that's pretty much all of the major points I wanted to discuss. For the majority of people, like the majority of cards you're sending, PSA is going to be your best bet. At the moment, in this grading environment, unless something changes, BGS is usually going to be your worst bet. You can grade a few things out like faded cards, but to be honest, CGC does all of that as well, and I just think they're giving much more kind of generous and realistic grades at the moment than BGS, so it's hard to find any motivation to actually send a card to Beckett right now. So yeah, if you're sending a standard card, like not a faded card, not a misprint, PSA is your best bet if you're just looking at value. And otherwise, CGC is probably your best bet if you want subgrades or if you want to grade an error, if you want to grade a faded card, things like that. So yeah, that pretty much brings us to the end of this video, guys. I hope that was informative, helpful. I grade a lot of cards. I have a lot of experience grading, so I guess I figured this was something where it would probably be helpful just to throw out a guide on how I feel about grading in the present day of like late 2022. And so yeah, that brings us to the end of this video. So this is Schlost signing out. I'll see you guys all in the next video.